Thank you, everyone, for coming. Welcome to our evening talk this November. My name is Matthew Page. I'm the president of the North Reading Historical and Antiquarian Society, and I am also someone who lives just across the street in the Reverend Eliab Stone House that we are going to be speaking about tonight. And next slide, please. And as many of us in this room live in historical houses or have lived in historical houses in our lifetimes, we all know that every house has a story, and even newer houses, right? There have been several families that have lived there before any of us moved into the house. And this, as I was looking at putting together a presentation on the history of the Reverend Eliab Stone House, which is also the parsonage for the Congregational church here in North Reading, I thought of this amazing program that's on television in the UK, hosted by an amazing historian, David Olusoga, and it's called A House Through Time. And basically, he does this 6-part series focused on a single house and its story through time. Now, that's a pretty easy thing to do in England, right, where some of these houses, like the one we lived in before we moved to North Reading, our house in England, before we moved here, it was built in 1550. So we joked that when we were moving to North Reading and moving into a house that was built in 1760, that we were upgrading to all the modern conveniences. But one of the things that is really striking, again, as you dive into the history of any house, even in here in Massachusetts and North Reading, is what stories they have to tell. And in this case, the house that, if it was not November and pitch black, we could see across the street there on the hill, but all of us have in our mind's eye, is the house that was built in 1761 and served as the parsonage for the Congregational church, the home of the minister and his family until 1931. And at that point, it actually was in about 1928 when I think the church decided that this big old creaky house was probably costly to maintain. Their ministers, I think, hadn't had such big families. It was a little bit of overkill in terms of the amount of house that the church needed. And at that point, they got together and they decided to get the wheels in motion to sell it. Now, I had thought, based on when the sort of transition from a parsonage to a civilian house had happened, that this had happened because of the Great Depression, But actually, the wheels started turning on that transaction in 1928, before the stock market crashed. So my talk tonight, I'm going to divide into 4 sections. The first section, we're going to talk about the man himself, the Reverend Eliab Stone. I wish we knew more about him, but we know enough to sort of paint a picture of this man who was a very interesting fellow. And then we're going to talk about Cyrus Peirce. I thought you pronounced it Peirce, but I've found out that in fact he would have pronounced it Cyrus Peirce, who was the minister after the Reverend Stone, and he was a pioneer of public education in Massachusetts, a figure that really is much better known for his subsequent career than what he did during his time here in North Reading. Third, we're going to talk about an interesting couplet of ministers, one of whom his son went on to be one of the major abolitionists in the Presbyterian Church, and then another one of our ministers who sadly went down in history as a major apologist for slavery and for segregation, and he was a major anti-abolitionist. So we'll tell his story. And then finally, hope we don't get too sad at the end note, but we'll talk about a little girl who lived in the house in 1918, who passed away sort of when she was in first grade. And just a reminder that, again, even in the earliest parts of the 20th century, people's lives were cut short by preventable disease. And this was a story that, again, we kind of uncovered as we were researching the story of the house. Next slide, please. So fortunately, we have some really interesting photographs of the house through different periods in its history. And I know this is a picture that Tom really likes because it shows sort of how the original entrance of the house was different, and how there was a porch and a really spectacular barn here on the house Presumably that barn was actually, built probably not long after the house itself was built in 1761. And of course, that formidable wall, which I joke, is like looks like it could, keep an army at bay, that's out in front of the house. That was there as well during that period. And I don't know if you can see them, but of course the 6, what are now 5, really impressive maple trees that are out in front of the house now were planted in the 1870s. And so you can see them in those pictures, and some very nicely dressed ladies on the front. I believe that's the members of the Kingsbury family, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Next slide, please. And here we are, a little better photo resolution in the 1880s. And what I really like about this photograph, if you can see it here, is the hexagonal shaped water well, the well there. And again, we have a much clearer picture of the front of the house, which, with the exception of the disappearance of the porch there, is very similar in many different ways. Next slide, please. And here we are in 1947, and this photo is thanks to John Richards, who's in the audience here now, whose grandparents, the Culletons, lived in the house at this time. So he shared very kindly several pictures, which you'll see throughout this presentation, of the house during this period. And again, you can see that the barn is gone now. We have the very, sort of quaint, probably 1930s, 1940s two-car garage there on the side there. And again, as we know, we had much bigger snowstorms back then. And those of you that are eagle-eyed can, of course, see the Congregational church in the background there. Next slide, Anna. Wonderful. And here we are. I took this picture just the other day in 2024, trying to take it from the same vantage point. You can see the Congregational church, right there in the background there. At some point, we lost that 6th tree here in the middle, so we've got just 5 at the moment. But really, in many ways, very much unchanged overall since that time period. Next slide. So, as many of you have noted over the last 2 years, and certainly Pastor Rick knows, we had an addition put on the house in 2023. This basically sits on the footprint of an old sunroom that was built by the Sawyers, who many of you know lived in the house from 1953 to 2002. And the object of this addition for us was to access this 3rd floor. And the 3rd floor is this incredibly cavernous space. I'll show you a picture of it in a moment. But and it also solved some of the challenges that all old houses have, which is that their bathroom internal plumbing facilities are not the greatest. So this was the main purpose of that space, and to basically help insulate the house a lot better. Next slide. So here's some interior shots of the historic parts of the house. In the front of the house, you have these 2 south-facing reception rooms. And what always strikes me when I go into these rooms is how really posh, how fancy they would have been for 1761, especially for a farm town like North Reading. And many of you have been in and are familiar with the Putnam House, which of course was built just 40 years earlier and is much more rudimentary. So really, the North Parish's 2nd minister had a lot fancier setup than his predecessor from the get-go. And you had this incredible staircase with very, very wide steps going up. So all this woodwork is, again, with the exception of the floors in this main hallway, are original. Next slide. And here is that upstairs room that I was mentioning that we opened up, and some features from it, including this incredible sort of post and beam construction. It's hard to see here, but the very thin bricks that, according to the mason that came to look at them as we were redoing the house, said these are the kinds of bricks that were brought over from England as ballast in ships so they were of that sort of much thinner size. You have sort of fun Victorian type of era features like this marble fireplace, which is now in one of those new bathrooms I was telling you about that that have given us a little better plumbing situation. And you can see with the sort of my feet there to scale, this is on the third floor, the incredibly wide boards, from trees that were hundreds and hundreds of years old that were in the house. And so these are just some of the historical features that you can see walking around the house. Next slide. So the Reverend Stone, really, really interesting fellow. He was the second minister of the North Parish of Reading, and he succeeded, of course, Daniel Putnam. He came to North Reading fresh out of Harvard, age 24, and received quite a generous settlement. Maybe Rick can give us some perspective on this. He had a sign-on bonus, so an initial settlement of 160 pounds, plus an annual salary of 74 pounds, which sort of back of the napkin calculations was about sort of $32,000 in today's money. So, for a new minister, yeah, exactly. Where's your son? Yeah, the times changed. So North Reading was keen to kind of keep the momentum. The North Parish was keen to keep the momentum on their parish going after the Reverend Putnam retired, and they brought in Reverend Stone, who was born in Framingham, as you can see. He was descended from really quite wealthy gentleman farmers in that locality. The Stone family were very early colonists of Framingham. So, in the Massachusetts State Archives, there are documents where the Stones are negotiating with the indigenous population to sort of, acquire land for their farms there. Now, as one of the, first things that Pastor Rick and I, discussed when we moved in was, of course, that the Reverend Stone is known and still known, sadly, as the longest serving minister in North Reading. He holds the record at, I believe, 61 years, 62 years. He reportedly conducted the marriages of the great-grandchildren of some of the couples that he married early on in his tenure. He was also, I think, a really idiosyncratic guy. So he was a rigid disciplinarian and a Puritan in his religious beliefs, but he also distilled whiskey, and he accumulated a lot of sort of personal property. I mean, you saw the house, it's pretty snazzy. For 1760, he also acquired a farm down on Lower Elm Street, and his sons bought up land in town as well. Judd, you may know more about this, but the old Stone farm was located between what was later known as the Pickard and Rayner farms. Yep, exactly. So Judd's our expert on the sort of yeah. You sell yourself short, but anyway. So the Stones had property throughout what was that the North Parish. And of course, at least this is what has come down in history about him, is that the Reverend Stone would march off with the local Minutemen whenever the alarm was sounded, complete with his musket and his ministerial wig, his minister's wig that he wore when he was preaching. Now, what was a little bit sort of tough is that the Reverend Stone, tough on his congregation, is that he really didn't know when to throw in the towel. So the Reverend Stone just kind of carried on fulfilling his duties, and each year that went by, he became less and less capable of doing that. But his congregation felt really bad about replacing him. They didn't want to kind of unceremoniously cut him off by that point. At that point, none of them really even knew anyone different than him in terms of the preaching. So in 1819, they appointed the Reverend Cyrus Peirce, another Harvard grad, to assist the then 82-year-old Reverend Stone. And it was at that point that things kind of got interesting in the parish, as we were talking about earlier, with the schism between the congregation, the Trinitarians and the Unitarians. But the Reverend Stone passed away a few years later in 1822. Next slide, please. So the Reverend Cyrus Peirce is our next sort of character in this story. And he's a really interesting fellow because, as we said, he came to North Reading Early on in his career, he had been a school teacher on Nantucket, but he decided, I'm going to go back to seminary and I'm going to become a minister. And so he did that, and then came straight to North Reading and was ordained. And but he kind of couldn't peel himself away from the school teaching. So even while he was in North Reading as the minister, he became the supervisor of the local district schools. He opened up a private school in North Andover. He kind of had these, I guess, two different draws on his vocation, so to speak. And as some people in this room may know, unlike Stone, who, as we said, was sort of a fairly staunch Puritan, Peirce was a theological liberal. And he didn't disguise this fact in terms of his preaching to his congregation. So very soon what happened is there was a split within the congregation in North Reading, which had, again, become used to the Stone sort of tradition, and those that were much more traditional, and then those that were starting to sort of hear, listen to, believe some of the preaching that the Reverend Peirce was doing, and became more sort of Unitarian, Universalist inclined as well. So Peirce left North Reading sort of before all this came to a head. So he left the parish in 1827 to go off and pursue his private school that he was operating up in Andover, ironically with a Putnam descendant, one of the larger universe of Putnam descendants. And it was at that point that the construction of the meeting house, this building that we're in, was underway. So that was completed in 1829. And after it was completed, the people of the town got together, and it was voted that only the Orthodox Congregationalists could use this building to worship. And the Unitarians needed to, find some other space. But, being a fairly democratic group, I guess, they sort of came back a few years later, and by 1832, again, Peirce had left the scene, but his sort of legacy was percolating on. By 1832, the support for the liberal cause in town had grown to the point that during a new vote that was taken, it was stipulated that the two factions in town, the Trinitarians and the Unitarians, could use this space equally. So this uneasy coexistence went on for about 4 years, at which point, we all know, the Congregationalists, the Trinitarians, decided to build their own dedicated house of worship across the street. And they left the meeting house altogether. What was interesting, and as I mentioned this to Deb when we were talking before the presentation, the more liberal Unitarians and Universalists experienced their own schism a few years later, and then the Universalists, also known as the Parish Society, right, they took over the control of this meeting house. And what's interesting is, really, as a sort of religious body, they petered out pretty quickly. They only had a few members. It became much more of sort of a civic organization. And also they kind of inherited this space, which then they spent the next almost 100 years leasing out to different groups. The town, used it for different things. There's a whole list, and Deb's got sort of the chronology there in her hand about how this building was used, until finally the Parish Society sort of gave up the ghost and gave the building to the town in 1931. So that's kind of how this building went from being a house of worship, really very briefly, then became sort of a general meeting space that people did use to worship in, but also a lot of other stuff was happening. Exactly, the Baptists were using it, the Methodists were using it, the town was using it, the school children were using it, and then eventually it reverted to the town in 1931. But reverting back to Peirce's story here, we can tie it together. So before he left the parish and the ministry, he opened up this private school, as I mentioned, but he parted ways with Putnam because Putnam was really strict, and Peirce was a real sort of almost like, like Montessori type ahead of his time. He was really, sort of, again, far more into avoiding hard discipline and sort of convincing children to focus on their studies through what he called moral persuasion. So I don't know, Anna, do you think moral persuasion or strict discipline is better in school? Okay, okay. Good answer. Good answer. So the Reverend Peirce sort of closed up that school in 1830, and then he went back to Nantucket. He opened up a new private school in Nantucket, advertising that his school would be, quote, worthy of patronage, where male and female will receive a thorough English education. Boys will be prepared for college, French, Spanish, algebra, bookkeeping, navigation, and surveying, also gymnastics and calisthenics. All ages received tuition $10 per quarter. So this was his shtick. So Matt, you'll be interested in all this here. So many of Peirce's Islander students in this new sort of school went on to achieve great things. So what's ironic is some of you may have caught in that ad that he was really focusing on boys, but actually two of his most distinguished students that went on to do amazing things were women. The first was Maria Mitchell, and she became an acclaimed astronomer and educator, gaining notoriety for being the first American scientist to discover a comet. She later joined the faculty of Vassar College and co-founded the American Association for the Advancement of Women. And then Mary Swift, another one of his students, went on to work at the Perkins School for the Blind and helped teach a remarkable student named Laura Bridgman, who was deaf-blind. So you know about Laura Bridgman? Yeah, she was a deaf-blind student with whom Swift worked to develop a form of finger talk, allowing Laura to communicate for the first time. So she was a pioneer, in other words, in deaf-blind communication. And not only did she do that, but then later she went on to help establish the YWCA. So this was sort of part of Peirce's legacy. So at that point, he had gained a lot of notoriety for becoming a distinguished educator. He helped establish a public high school on Nantucket, which again was sort of one of the first of its kind, not just in Massachusetts, but in the country. And he was determined to make it a model for other schools to follow. What was interesting is he also was an abolitionist and fiercely opposed the racial segregation of island schools, which again were probably more cosmopolitan than your average school in Massachusetts because of the whaling industry. So there are people from a lot of different nationalities that were there on the island. But he ran up to opposition to that from the native islanders. In 1839, he was asked by Horace Mann. Some of you may know Horace Mann. He was a Massachusetts state senator that later became head of the state's Board of Education, first Secretary of Education in the country, right, in a state. And Mann asked Peirce to set up Massachusetts teacher training colleges called normal schools. Some of you may be familiar with that term. It persisted, well into the 20th century. That first normal school was established at Lexington, and later it moved around, but it sort of ended up in Framingham, and it later evolved into Framingham State University. So what's interesting is Framingham State University to this day views Cyrus Peirce as essentially their founding father, and there's a lot of connection at the school at FSU between the history of Peirce and his work and so forth. Now we'll finish off Peirce's story by sort of talking a little bit about Peirce. I think as I was researching him, it was clear that he was someone who suffered from a lot of work-related stress, and he was fairly good at writing this down and cataloging this and sending the equivalent of emails to his boss about how stressed out he was. So his boss being Horace Mann. So this was a challenging assignment. He was just thrown into this with not a lot of resources or personnel, and he tried tendering his resignation at multiple times, and Mann kept persuading him to stay on. And finally, he wrote to Mann, "Dear sir, kind sir, let me go and have no hard thoughts. Should I stay much longer, I must lay my bones here." So this was him, again, writing a letter to his boss about his average work week. So needless to say, maybe he had a little bit of the melodrama, but I think, this job definitely took a significant toll on his health. Bottom line is he stayed involved in education and schools till his sort of dying day, and his personal motto, "Live to the truth," remains the motto of Framingham State University to this day. Next slide, please. Oh, the Peace Congress. Yeah, so that's a good question. It was convened in Paris in 1849 by Victor Hugo, the famous author, and it was like many of the efforts during the sort of 1800s and early 1900s attempt to sort of create world peace by bringing together people from different nations. But it was a big deal in those days in 1849 to travel all the way to Paris from the U.S. So yeah, Peirce was quite he had become kind of an internationally known figure at that point. So the third chapter in our little story tonight is about these sort of the abolitionists and the anti-abolitionists that lived in the house. And we're about to also get into the segment of the portion of the evening where I'm going to give you a short fun fact on each of the ministers, because there's no way to really tell you in great detail about each of them, or else we'd be here all night. But these are the sort of the few successors to Peirce. So after Peirce, we have this very earnest preacher, the Reverend Eastman, who preaches in North Reading for a little while and then moves out west, as a lot of people from North Reading were doing during that time, because of course the Ohio River Valley was opening up. The farmland out there was a lot better. Judd, you know this, a lot of farmers from North Reading were like, the farmland here is poor, we're heading out west, and this was sort of the time. So he was sort of the ministerial, the clergyman equivalent of that. Well, his son, the Reverend John Eastman, who grew up in the parsonage here as a young lad, he became a staunch abolitionist. And during the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in 1845, when the issue of slavery was coming to a big head in terms of the Presbyterian Communion, he was one of 13 out of 181 leaders of the Presbyterian Church who voted against the resolution that, quote, "the existence of domestic slavery under the circumstances which it is found in the southern portion of our country is no bar to Christian communion." So in other words, Presbyterians were trying to say slavery is okay, it's not out of whack with your Christian values. He was one of only 13 out of 181 sort of Presbyterian leaders who voted against that. And so that was a really big deal. That's sort of his historical legacy. Now, on the flip side of it, a couple ministers later, we have the Reverend John Orcutt. And the Reverend John Orcutt, the more I read about him, the more sort of a villain that he sort of comes out to be. And this is really tough, because you do want to say, okay, this guy's a man of the cloth, but he was really a renowned anti-abolitionist. North Reading was his third posting. He had served in Ludlow, Vermont, and then Andover, Mass. before that. He came to North Reading, had a fairly uneventful tenure here, and then went out to become the minister in Uxbridge, Massachusetts. Well, it was in 1845, when he was minister in Uxbridge, that the renowned abolitionist Frederick Douglass came on a speaking tour of New England and spoke in Uxbridge, stopped there on a speaking tour. And when he was there, he called out Orcutt by name during his talk about his racist views. And he said, quote, "If I go bleeding and panting, fugitive as I am to yonder Orthodox church," referring to Orcutt's Congregationalist church, "I am bolted out by your Reverend Orcutt." And he accused Orcutt of having, quote, "cravenly warned his congregants not to attend his talk on abolitionism at the Unitarian church in town." So again, remember, we're only sort of 20 years after this big schism in New England, and there's still this divide in terms of views at that point. And Douglass was right in calling out Orcutt, because Orcutt at that time was already a key figure in an organization called the American Colonization Society. And this is its branch, one of its branches, the New York City Colonization Society, showing, this group of coming to Africa and with the purpose of negotiating to resettle freed black slaves in West Africa, in what is now the area that is now known as Liberia. So the American Colonization Society, is really recognized by scholars today as a sort of a fundamentally, racist solution to what was viewed at the time as, an increasing population of Black Americans in the United States. And so it was organized by Southern slave owners, Northern conservative sort of figures to effect the resettlement of free Black Africans in Africa as an alternative to abolition and emancipation. So in other words, right, there were free Black people living in the North. A lot of people didn't like that. They saw this as a way to kind of relocate them back to Africa. But of course, a lot of those free Black slaves had lived in the United States for generations. They lived in North America for generations. They had nothing in common with, the peoples specifically in Liberia, right, which is a very, small subset of people in Africa, of course. And it was really predicated, the whole project was predicated on the view that people of color couldn't be integrated into American society. So that was sort of the whole gist behind the American Colonization Society. And Orchid, this was his thing. This was really what he was involved in. And of course, the society itself did succeed in transporting several thousand freed, slaves to Liberia. And that, in turn, gave rise to really that small West African country's complex history, which involved the creation by these resettled slaves of what they called the Americo-Liberian Republic, in which they proceeded to subjugate the indigenous inhabitants and set up sort of this very strange sort of antebellum South sort of social structures that persisted right up until 1980, when their regime, which had persisted at that point for over 150 years, was overthrown in a bloody coup. And I have some personal connection to this because one of my first jobs when I joined started working for the Marine Corps as a civilian, as an intelligence analyst, was supporting the Marines who were ashore in Liberia in 2003, who were responding to a lot of the instability and civil war there. And so, again, it was kind of interesting to me that here I am coming full circle, and I'm starting to think about the ins and outs of Liberian politics within the context of the house that I live in. So, having gone off on that tangent, let's go back to Orchid and his decision to dedicate his career to the American Colonization Society. So he really left the ministry at that point, and after Uxbridge, and from 1850 until his death in 1879, he basically served as like a bureaucrat, as a senior figure within the American Colonization Society. And he could do this as a full-time job because the American Colonization Society was all like a big fundraising thing. So a lot of the abolitionists, viewed it also as sort of this hotbed of corruption, because there's sort of a lot of money changing hands, but not a lot of activity happening in terms of the society. What was even worse is that Orchid kind of led the more racist wing of the American Colonization Society. So within that group, there had been another kind of little bit of a schism. See, this is a constant theme in the history of this house, between members of the society who wanted to raise funds to help educate and assist the freed Black slaves who had been moved back to Africa and try to make their lives better back in Liberia. And then this other side of the equation, the members like Orchid, who were championing sort of like, let's raise money to kind of kick more of them out of the United States and get them over to Liberia. So that was a real big tension within the group, and it persisted basically right up until, sort of beyond his death. It continued until the relevance of the group really decreased. All right, next slide, please. So this is what I would call the speed round of the discussion. So we've gone deep on these sort of three interesting early figures within the history of the house and the history of the church. And this is more about sort of interesting facts of sort of the remaining ministers of the 19th century. So we have the Reverend Allen, and so really the interesting thing about him is that his father had been the publisher of the Newburyport Herald, and you can actually see if you squint his name, E.W. Allen, Newburyport, Mass. It was his dad who published that paper, which really gave rise to a lot of the abolitionist thinkers and journalists within the 19th century. People like William Lloyd Garrison and Whittier were sort of, the abolitionist movement was actually heavily centered on Newburyport. The Reverend Jones, here we are, Thomas Newton Jones. He's our next minister. He was the state representative for Reading during the 1956 General Court session, so he was our state rep. So I don't know, Pastor Rick, have you ever thought about going into politics and becoming a state rep? Anyway, so your predecessors did. He was, quote, an amiable, sincere man who made many friends and retained them throughout his life. So that's a nice way to be remembered. The Reverend Kingsbury, who we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, his younger brother, Harlan Page Kingsbury, enlisted in the 9th New Hampshire Regiment during the Civil War. But what was interesting, he had sort of a tragic story, but as a private, he was taken prisoner in action at the Battle of Spotsylvania in 1864, and he died in Andersonville prison 3 months later. So the Reverend Kingsbury, he had lost his younger brother as a prisoner of war, in one of the most inhumane prison camps during the Civil War, the famous Andersonville. The Reverend Foster, Frank Foster, he taught mathematics at the Naval Academy before going to the seminary and being ordained in North Reading. But what was interesting about him is he later became a renowned theological historian, a historian of the church. And he spent most of his career teaching at Oberlin in Ohio, where he was one of the first faculty members there to hold a doctoral degree. And he was a talented linguist and inspiring to all of us who feel like we can't learn anything more. He taught himself Arabic at the age of 76. The Reverend George Allen, he was minister here. Let's see. Oh, maybe I've left out a fun fact about him. The Reverend George Allen, I lost my fun fact about him. Apologies there. The Reverend Fay, he's one of the most widely served ministers. He served in 8 parishes before he came to North Reading. So I don't know, Rick, that seems like a fairly prolific career. The Reverend Kilburn, his successor, was initially a Methodist minister and then left the ministry for several years to become a traveling book salesman. And then he decided to actually go back to seminary, and he graduated in 1892, at which point he came to North Reading. So you see a theme here. People, the ministers in North Reading in the sort of 19th and early 20th century, many of them were either, because it was such a small parish, they either came here as their very first posting or as their sort of twilight posting. It was far less usual for them to kind of come mid-career. The Reverend Colburn there, our last one before 1900, he, as a young boy, had served as a drummer boy in the 11th Massachusetts Regiment, where his father and brothers were serving as soldiers during the Civil War. And then, he stayed, so he was a drummer boy, and then he stayed in the Army for 7 years after the Civil War, which again was very unusual. Most people were let go at the end of the war, and then he went into the ministry. Next slide, please. So I think you remember me mentioning the Reverend Kingsbury. I think because we have that photo of the house during the 1870s, which was his tenure, and then this great picture of him and his family, including this dashing young chap here, sort of striking a pose. I think the Reverend Kingsbury liked photography. I think he probably liked gadgets and thought this was pretty neat to take photos of his house and his family. But his daughter Mabel did an amazing thing. She wrote poems about her siblings, which have somehow come down in history. So she wrote a poem about her her brother Noah, and she said, "The jolly boy Noah Jackson came after some years. He changed his name. He has a wife and a canoe. He has a laugh and is never blue. He's had some good times and some bad, but nothing ever makes him sad. His wife, a modest little thing, to him the best in life does bring. Their home, harmonious, artistic, was hospital when he was sick. Here's to his laugh, here's to his wife. Well may they be, long be their life." And then she wrote another one, which I like, about her younger sister, Grace Ethel. And I'm not sure if Mabel was this young lady here or perhaps this young lady here. It would be one of the two. This must be, of course, young Grace Ethel. Grace Ethel was the last to appear. She was the baby for many a year. She felt pretty bad that she wasn't a boy. She'd rather have boys' things than any girl's toy. She learned to skate, to swim, to coast, but of cooking she never did boast. In all things athletic, she's right up to date. Perhaps she's for suffrage. She hasn't a mate. She can earn her own money and spend it as well. So again, you can see young Grace, looking very pensive there. But I think what's hard when you're researching a house is finding these little bits that reveal. You can find when people were born and died and when they were on the census roll, but it's really hard to find these personal details and personal touches. And so thanks to young Mabel, we have poems about her siblings. Next slide, please. So this is our last round robin of ministers here, and I hope you're enjoying, like me, the fun fact about each of them. The Reverend Hoffman, who, right after the turn of the century, he was a popular minister. When he resigned from his post as pastor of North Reading, the church passed a unanimous vote imploring him to stay. And his wife, Elena, was an accomplished musician and a leader in the social and spiritual life in the parish. The Reverend Junkins, his successor, I don't know a lot about him, but what's really neat is he was living in the house at 1 Peabody Street during the 1910 census. And so my fun fact about him is kind of what his household looked like at that moment in time in 1910. So he had 3 children. Mercia, who was a daughter. She was 4 years old and had been born in Vermont, so before he moved to North Reading. Hurstine, Hurstine, which is I don't think that's in the top 10 baby names in 2024. Hurstine was a son too, born in Vermont. And Eunice, a daughter, 18 months, born in New Hampshire. So again, he had moved around a lot, as many ministers do. And he also, at that time, they had a servant, a sort of 18-year-old girl who clearly was helping them look after the kids at that time. The Reverend Goddard, and he was, his time in North Reading was marked by the fact that even though he was he was known as being a man of strong religious convictions and courageous in standing for any principle for which he deemed right, but he died at age 47 while still pastor in North Reading. So he died in 1917. And there were several ministers that died whilst they were on seat, as sometimes people would say. And the Reverend Goddard was one. And we'll come back to the Reverend Walsh in a minute, but the Reverend Jones, the interesting thing about him is he was English. So he emigrated from England to the United States in 1913, was naturalized, and then was ordained in 1915. Now, the Reverend Coffin, a very common name, also common name on Nantucket, he was remembered as a great lover of nature. He was also a poet. In 2 of his poems, The Bear and Evening Songs of the Hermit Thrush, were published in whatever, big national poetry magazines or what have you. And my wife will find this interesting. His daughter-in-law, Margaret Coffin, went on to become a path-breaking defense intelligence analyst for the U.S. Defense Department. So that was an interesting fun fact about him. So the last inhabitant of the house, and maybe Pastor Rick knows more about this gentleman, the Reverend Nielsen, he was a bit of an odd, unusual minister, I would say. So he did not appear to be a Congregationalist. I think he was a Lutheran. and this, so I don't know what the what the calculus was there. He was born in North Dakota to a Danish father and an American mother, and I think he was sort of filling in as maybe as a part-time minister, but it lasted longer than probably he anticipated. He lived in the house from 1929 to 1931, and he was paying rent of $25 a month. I wish our mortgage was still $25 a month, but he was he later, I guess, moved out as the church at that point decided to deacquisition the building itself. Next slide, please. So I don't mean to make this a bit of a tearjerker, but this is a story I ran across as I was researching the history of the house here, and this is about young Esther Walsh. So Esther was the daughter of the Reverend Walsh and his wife, and she passed away whilst they were living in the house at age 7 in 1918 of diphtheria. Yeah, it was really sad, and so what I decided to do, knowing that the Historical Society has all the records from the school in our Margaret Parker archives room, is I went back through the school's records and indeed found all the attendance records for the first grade, the year that she was here. I also found, sort of more upbeat, a fun little rundown of basically their average class day in first grade in 1918, 1917. So let's see. The handwriting's hard to read, but you sort of have, arrival at 8:30, playtime at 8:45, reading, and then let's see, penmanship, nature. We have some rest time, and let's see what else we have here. We have some mathematics, more reading in the afternoon, more rest, and then some games at the end of the day. So, good reminder that kids were in the fourth grade or first grade at the batch back in 1917. We're having school days a lot like the first graders do now. And so here is the first class list of names. And so we had Fred Russell. These are great names. We had Fred, Isidore, Eleanor, Elmer, Mabel, Odessa, Edith, Robert, and then Esther Walsh. What's sort of, again, a little bit sad is you see that in the school record, when these children sort of went up a year in age, turned 7 to 8, turned 8 to 9 here, 5 to 6, and so forth. The teacher in the book had crossed off their previous age and written in their new age. But we don't see that here with Esther. Her age is still 7 years old at the end of the school year, because just before Christmas, she went home from school ill and she never came back in January after the Christmas holiday. So she passed away. And so you can see it must have been hard. This was a very small sort of first year juniors class with let's see, what's this, 8 other children. There have been a total of 9 of them. And then afterwards there are 8. So when you're in Riverside Cemetery, little Esther Walsh, her marker is there, and you can go by and pay your respects, just like I think my son Jack and I have done on occasion. So next slide. All right, this is our final slide, and this is where my friend John Richards has been so helpful in sort of providing some details, and it's where we'll end our presentation in a moment. And this is sort of the post-parsonage history. So the post-parsonage history has really been dominated, of course, by the fact that the Sawyers lived in that house from 1953 to 2002. It was really sort of a very short series of owners before then. But as John can attest, the Culletons really had a very nice few years there as well. So after the gentleman to buy it from the church was Nelson Copeland, and he was a house painter here in town. And he also had 3 sort of adult children who were all living in the house with him and working, including the daughters, and I think bringing in extra income as well. So my theory is that, being sort of a interior decorator, house painter, he bought this as a fixer-upper and kind of flipped it. So he lived there with his family, his older kids, for about 4 years, and then they sold it to the Huntresses, Marion and Bill Huntress. And the Huntresses, Bill Huntress was an insurance salesman, and he was he was well-to-do, but he was relatively transient. So he had moved from away, and then after a few years, he moved away again. And the Deckers bought it. The Deckers were a nice sort of older retired couple, and he was from Maine originally and had been a pharmacist in Beverly during his career, and then had retired, and they sort of bought a place in North Reading. And then when he passed away, his wife Evelyn moved back to Maine and sold it to the Johnsons. Now, the Johnsons, he was, again, from away. He was a New York-born metallurgist, and they lived really in the house just for a couple of years with their young children before moving to Maine. I'm not sure what job he got in Maine as a metallurgist, but, he moved to Saco, and the rest is history. Yeah, maybe, exactly. Maybe at a shipyard or something. And that's when the Culletons bought the house in 1947. And John, I know you and I had talked about some dates. This is just what the deeds say. I don't mean to insist that everyone was here in these particular years, but the James Culleton was from Chicago. He was a department store merchandise manager, according to the census, and they lived at 1 Peabody. There's a lot of great photos, including this one here. Right, and that is, John, is that correct? Is that your mother and your older sister? Yeah, there's another. There are a few pictures of him. Yeah, it's great, and they have this nice little trellis there off the side. So yeah, they look very, very happy there. And they, for whatever reason, John, you may know, they moved in 1953 to 452 Park. So they stayed in North Reading, but they moved to a different house. Maybe to downsize, or? Got it. So yeah, they had 2 locations, and exactly. And so what was nice is John's grandmother Florence, who's pictured here. She was very active in North Reading's many clubs. So again, Tom, someone like your mom may have run across her in the Garden Club, the Upland Club. She organized canteen dances at the town hall on behalf of the North Reading YMCA, and she liked directing local theater productions. And again, so you can pick John's brain if you want to know more about the Culletons. I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole, because we have the Sawyers, of course, who purchased the house from the Culletons and really made that their family home for almost 50 years, which is pretty remarkable. Clark Sawyer, who you can see, he was a town selectman and a local businessman. He had been an Army veteran. Some of the people in this room probably remember Clark and Lillian. Lillian, his wife, was from Texas and was kind of a sparky personality, I was told. And they raised their children there. He built that commercial building right across from the Hornet's Nest, so where Edward Jones is now. And the Sawyers put some additions on the house. They got rid of that sort of 2-car garage that had been there in some of those Culleton pictures, and added the 3-car garage you see there now in 1968. And then Lillian, being from Texas, she loved to swim, so she put in the swimming pool that now my wife and I and children are perpetually cleaning, and she added that. But that's the story there. And then Patrick, who some of you may have known, he served on the Historic District Commission with Dave Ham there. He was an insurance executive, and he moved to Maine in 2021. And then the Pages moved from England and are there now since 2021. Next slide, Anna. So that concludes our presentation. About 2 minutes, before you had to, get the old hook and pull me off stage. But all I would say is that I think, going down the rabbit hole of this one house, you can see that every house in North Reading has a history. The more you dig, the more you uncover, and it's really remarkable. And that's true of, older houses, like the one that, Amy, you and Matt live in, or, newer houses. So it's fun to dive into the history of your house, and it's a project that the Historical Society can help you do. It's a free service that we provide our members. So I will leave you with that pitch to join the Historical Society. Thank you very much, and please, by all means, any questions that you have, let me know. Are there any questions? Deb?
I wanted to show everybody the flag of Liberia.
Nice. It is the American flag with the one star. Yes, indeed. It is. Yeah. So we have a North Reading, Liberia connection. Maybe not a good one, but one nonetheless.
Visual value. I didn't. You look at all the flags of our world, and we hardly ever see the red stripes. So now.
Yeah.
The capital of Monrovia?
The capital is James Monroe, who, of course, was one of the major pushers and movers behind the American Colonization Society. Yes?
So it's my thought that there were a lot of ministers.
Yes.
More than maybe the average number for a town like this. And was tithing the way that churches sustain themselves, and was there a fact of what kind of revenue farming and shoemaking town that was hampering to like keeping the ministers because the flow of money to the churches might be elsewhere?
Yeah, so the question, I'm just repeating it for the microphone here, is that did North Reading have more ministers than average? Like, was there turnover perhaps more because of funding issues? And I can defer to Tom and Pastor Rick to sort of maybe give their insights as well. My perception of researching the house is that that the turnover was probably average. It had probably more to do with really what was going on in these individual gentlemen's lives. I think that at some points, in the church's history, they went and did gap the position. So the position was, there were some years which I didn't really, we could go through and look at those specifically and see how long those missions were, so to speak. But I think for the most part, they had good coverage. I think it was a challenge, as you can imagine, recruiting people to come and serve as a minister in a small parish. And that sort of explains what I had mentioned earlier, which is that I think that North Reading tended to get the bright-eyed and bushy-tailed new seminary graduates. As you saw, there were a few that basically were coming to to the clergy as a second career, or people who were at the really tail end of their ministerial career. But did you have any additional thoughts?
When people graduate, the first churches tend to be small in a country.
Mm-hmm.
And Reverend Ali, my predecessor, when he retired, didn't he take on?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. So there are, as you know, there are parishes where you can kind of scale up or scale down in terms of your full-time involvement. There are sort of full-time parishes, half-time parishes, or probably even parishes where they have multiple, like yours, where they have multiple pastors at different things. Yeah.
The color scheme on the exterior of the house, always been as it is now?
Yeah, I sense just by looking at the photos and what we know about sort of the early architectures, I think it's always been white with the sort of black shutters. Yeah.
I was wondering about the chimney, black light chimney. Sometimes sign that British loyalists.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So I was wondering if
That's fascinating. Yeah, I don't know. We know the Reverend Stone was definitely the opposite, and since he was there, since he was there from 1760 when it was built to 1822 when he died. What's interesting is even though the Putnam family held on to the Putnam House after Putnam left the clergy, the Stone House, so to speak, became the parsonage. So that's really interesting. I think part of that had to do with the fact that the Stones had sort of accumulated all this other property around town. And so I think that he probably at some point, although we don't know this for a fact, essentially like bestowed it on the church because his kids were fine. They had accumulated enough wealth and real estate beyond that. Whereas the Putnams were like, we really need our farm, that family. Yes, Tom?
I was going to make a comment on the chimney.
Yes.
And if you look at the photographs from the 1870s,
Mm-hmm.
you see that that you do not see the white top chimneys.
Uh-huh.
In the 1920s,
Oh, yeah.
when there was a considerable interest in colonial revival, kind of a second colonial revival architecture period, and you had the Boston architect Royal Barry Wills, the white chimneys with the black tops almost became a trademark of Royal Barry Wills in some of his houses.
Yeah.
So that so it became kind of trendy in the 1920s.
So they do look painted there, don't they?
To have them painted white with the black top. Sometimes they even went to the fact of it using a brick that had a glazed white exterior and a specially made black brick for the top.
Oh, interesting.
The other thing I'm intrigued by the doorway. If we look at all the photographs of the
older, this one?
Yes, from that one, you don't see the side lights on the.
Right, so those were added at some
Those
point.
must have been added in at a surprisingly later date. In that, it probably, if we could kind of go under the eaves of the porch, we would probably see a very interesting 1761 doorway canopy.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Skyline.
Huh.
The other thing that you can see in that shows up very nicely in this photograph is the dental work under the pitched roof.
Yes. Yep.
And
That's
and
called
that-
dentilation. Yep.
and that work in that house you really have to go to some pretty high fashion towns other than North Reading to find it. And you'll find it in towns, you won't find it in towns that are even, you might say, more prosperous than ours.
Mm-hmm.
Either he had a very unusually skilled and clever carpenter design and build the house, or really put a great deal of thought into its exterior detailing. That really is unusually fine work.
And I think that goes back to the fact that he was kind of from a fairly upscale family in Framingham, and so he came here as like, I'm gonna sort of build the house I want to have rather than the house that I can necessarily afford. So yeah, it's a good observation. I'm mindful of the time. I don't want to keep people here too late, but what we could do afterwards, if people, we can wrap up now, and then people can come and we can shoot the breeze, or you can pick Tom's brain or Rick's brain or Judd's brain, because they have as much knowledge about these types of things as I do. So, but thank you all for coming. It was great to see you. Yeah.